At one point, I resigned after a year with the Department of Northern Saskatchewan. I resigned to take up a master's degree. I'd been told that I needed a Latin American, an Amazonian specialist to work with and basically to satisfy the expectations of EVIC and the Ministry of Justice that I had a legitimate research purpose and somebody to help keep me out of trouble, no doubt, in a somewhat politically fraught environment. One has to understand that that part of Venezuela at that time was completely beyond any national police or military control, like Yacuana, Yanomama, and other groups south of the Orinoco were basically fully autonomous politically. So there was an interest in not having foreigners getting into trouble, or maybe even worse, causing trouble for the Venezuelan authorities. So I applied to 3 places. I applied. Nashville had a Latin American Studies program. UBC had a program that I was admitted to, but not an obvious Latin Americanist to work with. And McGill, and at McGill there was Bernard Arcan, and I will not speak badly of the dead. I love Bernard. We had a good relationship over the years, but at the time when I was admitted to McGill, he was to be my supervisor. And on the first day, I moved, as I was married. We didn't have kids yet, but I was still married with my first wife, and we moved to Montreal, and she got into a program at Concordia, and I'm all set, to start master's studies, and I was determined I was going to do field work for a master's thesis with cinema. And I have my first meeting with Bernard, and he informs me that he's not taking on any new students. So, because he was just hired at Laval, and so he was shifting from McGill to Laval. And nobody in the Department of Anthropology thought it was worth letting me know, because it was very clear from my application materials that my intention was to work with Bernard or under Bernard's supervision to go back to Venezuela. So that was a major problem. Basically, I was not able to return to Venezuela. I couldn't get the visa, or I couldn't satisfy at least the permit system. I could get a visa to get to Venezuela, but I couldn't get the permit that I would need to work in indigenous territory. So, as luck would have it, at that time, I came in 1976, a very interesting moment in Quebec political history and in Cree political history, because it was that fall that René Lévesque's Parti Québécois came to power as the government of Quebec, and it was one year after the signing of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. So at that time, Dick Salisbury was a senior professor in the Department of Anthropology. He was also directing something called the Program in the Anthropology of Development. And Dick and some of his graduate students had done significant work around, let's say, the feasibility research or the social impact research around the hydro project. And one of those students was Harvey Feit. At the time I came to McGill, Harvey was still working on his PhD, but he had a period of years of being quite immersed in the first the testimony, the research, background research, and testimony that he gave in the Maloof court, which granted the interlocutory injunction that for a period of days halted the development of the James Bay hydro project. So Harvey was involved very much as a consultant and ally of the Crees and as an expert witness in the Maloof court. Dick Salisbury had a somewhat more arm's length relationship to that process. He was advising simultaneously the government of Quebec, the corporations, and the Crees via the kind of social impacts work that Harvey and other students had also contributed to. So there was Ignatius Iggy Larousic was one of that group. Nathan Elberg was a co-author of at least one of the reports, and there were a few others. So I came into a situation where there was a constituted community already doing work on the kinds of political issues that I was interested in, with people in an environment that I already found attractive. Geographically, northern Quebec and northern Saskatchewan look a lot alike. And of course, the Crees of Eowystsi and the Crees of the Churchill River Basin out west have some strong cultural and linguistic affinities, and the way of life, the hunting, fishing, trapping institutions and cultural outlooks are very similar. So I was rescued from my situation of not knowing what the hell I was going to now do for my graduate research. At that time, as I said, the agreement had been signed a year earlier, and one of the provisions of the agreement was an income security program for Cree hunters, fishers, and trappers. And Harvey Feit, following his engagement as an expert witness in the Maloof court, then worked very closely with the Cree leadership and a small handful of other professionals in negotiating the terms of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. The history in brief, the context legally in brief, was that, as expected, the Quebec Court of Appeals overturned, lifted the interlocutory injunction after a week, on an argument of balance of convenience, that the rights of 6,000 Crees could not stand against the rights and interests of 6 million Quebecers in the successful execution of this project. The Crees, of course, then, at that stage, they were quite determined to stop the project. And they had attempted to get the Supreme Court of Canada to hear the case. And the Supreme Court of Canada said, we will not hear the case until the Quebec Court of Appeals has ruled on the merits. So it was this legal maneuvering whereby the Quebec Court of Appeals was able to lift the interlocutory injunction on an argument of the balance of convenience, but would not rule on the merits of the case for a year. They needed time to study this, a few thousand pages of testimony, court record. Meanwhile, the project will become a fait accompli. And so that was really what forced the Crees to negotiate. But Quebec was also forced to negotiate because there was the risk that when the Court of Appeals had handed down its decision, which everyone knew would go against the Crees, the Crees would then be clear to go to the Supreme Court of Canada, and there could be a multi-billion-dollar risk, or there was a multi-billion-dollar risk. And the investors were very concerned about this, and so there was pressure on the governments of Quebec and Canada indirectly to negotiate the first treaty. Really, they were called comprehensive claim settlements in those days, but really it was the first treaty negotiated since 1923 in Canada with an Indigenous group. And it was a product of this quite unique legal context. So one of the many elements of this comprehensive claims agreement was this income security program for hunters. And Harvey and some of the Cree leaders with whom he worked closely, and I think in particular Philip Awashish, who, along with Billy Diamond, had been involved in organizing the Cree communities of northern Quebec that would be impacted by Hydro-Quebec's massive plans. Philip had been particularly interested in the hunting, fishing, and trapping and environment aspects of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. And so Philip and Harvey were quite instrumental in organizing a research project to see whether the income security program was doing what Cree hunters wanted it to do, which was effectively to give them a better cash flow, a better revenue flow, to enable them to continue hunting, fishing, and trapping. Trapping income had been on a long-term downward slope. In the 1920s, for example, people of my grandfather's generation were making as much money, Cree people were making as much money trapping as my grandfathers were making farming in a good year. By the 1970s, the price of furs just went down and down and down, partly in reaction to the largely in reaction over the multi-decade period to fur ranching. So the market was full of, from a furrier's point of view, high quality mink, high quality fox, in particular, and other species like beaver that were less successfully farmed also would go in and out of fashion. But the long and the short of it was that trapping was no longer an adequate source of cash. And people by now were dependent on bush planes, outboard engines. Since the Second World War, there was a system of social welfare, social security payments that most Cree families who were in the hunting sector benefited from. There was kind of an informal deal that if you went to the bush with your household, or at least that portion of your household that was not in residential schools, then you would get 6 months of your normal entitlement instead of 12 months. So it was a good deal for the government because it reduced their costs, and it was an attractive deal for the Crees because along with their fur income now they could have a good chunk of social welfare payment. It was not as happy a situation in some of the other provinces where welfare payments were cut off for people who didn't stay in the villages. Some provinces had or I shouldn't say, this of course was an Indian Affairs social welfare package, but in some provinces, the hunting, fishing, trapping economy was not seen as viable to the extent that it still was in northern Quebec. So it's you had a situation then that families had after the Second World War had a bolstered cash income, but by the 1970s it was again becoming too little. And so the income security program brought in a higher standard, a higher level of cash revenue. And that became my master's thesis, to look at that program. That gave me a foothold in Cree hunting camps, because Crees themselves, when I visited virtually all of the Cree villages as part of that research, and some of it was fairly standard interviewing and figuring out household income and talking about how people's activities on the land were affected by having additional cash. But also, people said to me, if you really want to know, if you really want to understand how it works on the land, you got to come to the land. So, of course, I couldn't do that in all 10 Cree communities. So, I guess there were fewer than 10 at the time. I guess because some had become dispersed. Some of the fur trade posts, when they had closed, lost their kind of summer resident population that would become scattered in other places. But following the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, Nemaska was reestablished, Waswanipi was reestablished. I couldn't do this work in all 10 communities. Harvey Fite actually was looking after the Waswanipi part of it. There was we collaborated in this project. I was the sort of more roving, mobile researcher in the other Cree communities. But for my ethnographic work, I had to choose a community, and kind of fell in love with Wemindji. The people, the physical setting on the coast. I found really intriguing the contrast between the subarctic forest of the mainland and the inland, and the kind of Arctic marine aspect offshore. Like within 2 or 3 kilometers, you go from a subarctic environment to an Arctic environment, and with completely different distribution of species. So offshore you have beluga whales, seals, polar bears, marine birds, and onshore you have black bears, moose, beaver, freshwater ducks, and the coast itself, this incredibly rich edge, typical kind of ecological edge, where you have these massive migrations of waterfowl, which sadly have been severely compromised in recent decades. I think, and many Cree hunters think, largely because of the impacts of hydro development on the coastal and marine environment. But it was a magical place, and so I went to work in that community. I did my interviews. I did documentary research with the Income Security Office in Quebec City, and all the way to goose hunting camps and winter hunting, trapping camps at Wemindji for the better part of a year, and wrote my master's thesis. In the course of doing that, I decided that for my doctorate I would continue with work with the Crees, and that I wanted really to get into Cree knowledge of the ecology, of the technologies for living in that environment. It was, again, it was something that harkened back to that interest in the embodied skills, I suppose, and competencies of dwelling in such environments.